Hello, everyone. Welcome to this educational program. Strategic reglobalization, great power rivalry comes for the multilateral trading system. I am Patricia Vasconcelos, a board member of the Association of Foreign Correspondents in the US and US and White House correspondent for SBT Brazilian TV network. Today, we have a pleasure to receive and talk with us with Dan Ikenson, Director of Policy Research at NDP Analytics. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure, Patricia. I'm happy to be with you all, and thank you also to Thanos Damatis of the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents for inviting me. And I would also like to thank the Hinrich Foundation for its sponsorship of this series and for publishing four of my papers over the past year, and another one's coming out next month. So happy about that. And I apologize to everybody who I had to ask to postpone this event last week until today because I was ill. But thank you for joining us again.
We're happy to have you here with us. Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce you properly. Just before that, an overview about our educational program today. So during this program, Dan will unpack for us, foreign correspondents, all the critical points of his latest research, strategic reglobalization, great power rivalry comes for the multilateral trading system. This educational program is developed in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation, Advancing Sustainable Global Trade. And the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents is solely responsible for the definition and the development of this program. About Dan, he's an economist and renowned international trade expert who has spent over 30 years analyzing, communicating, and influencing the formulation of US and global trade policy. Dan joined NDP Analytics after 9 years as director of the Cato Institute Center for Trade Policy Studies, where he led a team of lawyers, economists, and political sciences, conducting research on all manner of trade policy, on subjects spanning from free trade agreements to international investment treaties, trade laws to customs procedures, digital trade to the manufacturing economy. Dan has written dozens of policy papers. He has given congressional testimony. He has submitted statements and comments on proposed regulations to federal and state agencies. He appeared on national news programs and published scores of op-eds and articles in prominent media outlets. Prior to joining the Cato Institute in 2000, Dan was director of international trade planning for an international trade consulting firm here in Washington, D.C. And from 1990 to 1997, Dan was a trade policy analyst at International Trade Law Practices. In addition to his many studies and articles, Dan is co-author of the book Anti-Dumping Exposed: The Devilish Details of Unfair Trade Law. He earned an MA in economics from George Washington University. So I know you have some information to share with us, Dan. Before we start, if I can just pop up a question here for you. You argue in your paper that the most favored nation and national treatment, those concepts no longer exist, right? And the main rule of the trading system, which is a win-win exchange, does not happen anymore as it should be. Could you give us an example that could exemplify why this happened?
Sure. Well, thanks again, Patricia, for that introduction. I would say that those precepts of the multilateral trading system of national treatment, most favored nation, mean non-discrimination, that trade policy should be pursued in a way that treats investment and imports from all countries the same way. I am suggesting that we're entering an era where there is less incentive to adhere to those precepts and to those ideas. There's a lot of unilateralism going on. The United States, of course, most famously or infamously imposed tariffs on China in 2018 by circumventing the rules of the WTO and showing that it was more interested in being sort of a vigilante and defending its interests in a way that it sees most suitable to do so. And I think that presents a big problem, but it also reflects, it presents a problem for the trading system, but it also reflects sort of a change in the underlying conditions. The United States was a big supporter of the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the WTO. And one of the reasons it was is because it saw that institution as in U.S. foreign policy interest. And I think that that may no longer be the case. And that's why I'm concerned about the future of the WTO, the trading system, and that we're going to be turning toward trading arrangements that show discrimination and favoritism toward countries that align with U.S. interests, or countries that align with Chinese interests will get favorable treatment in trade, and those that don't will be discriminated against. So that spells potential contraction in the global economy and undermines the capacity of trade to help grow the economy.
I'm sure that our guests, they're going to have many questions for you. We are going to open to those questions. If you could start your presentation and share all the slides you brought to us, we are happy to hear and learn from you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate having the opportunity to have this conversation. So before turning to the sort of the theme of the paper, let me just give you a little bit more of my background, just so you get an idea of where I'm coming from. I was at the Cato Institute for over 20 years until March of 2021. And in my capacity there as director of the Trade Center and as a trade policy analyst, I was a big fan of the multilateral trading system, big supporter of it, big supporter of China's entry into the WTO, and an advocate of going easy on China as it was trying to implement the many reforms that it committed itself to over the years. I was a very big critic of U.S. government protectionism and unilateralism over the years. And I'm sorry.
No, we are hearing.
Okay, good. But in my last couple of years at Cato, I began to appreciate the real challenge that China presents to both the United States and the trading system. I began to understand that free trade can't really be pursued in a vacuum without sufficient regard for national security, but also that an increasing emphasis on national security would subvert respect for the trade rules. So let me take about 20 minutes or so to reiterate some of the major points in the paper and maybe broaden the lens a bit to provide a little more context. And then, since I'm speaking with journalists and reporters who tend to be more inquisitive than the average person, we can get into a Q&A and get the conversation rolling for the duration. So the major points of the paper, and let me just put up a slide here of, where do I share a screen? Yeah. Share that. Yeah. So just here's the title of the paper, and it's strategic reglobalization. Great power rivalry comes from the multilateral trading system. So the major points, as implied there, are that globalization is going through some changes, that geopolitical and national security considerations are driving those changes, and that the multilateral trading system is threatened by those changes. So let me get into that. So a central premise underlying the case for free trade is that voluntary trade is not a zero-sum game, but a positive-sum game, a win-win sort of exchange that benefits all the parties involved. And reducing trade barriers enlarges markets and increases the scope for specialization and economies of scale, which are essential to raising living standards around the world. So the economic benefits of trade exceed the economic costs of trade. So free trade is an economic net positive and a worthy objective. And I think that all remains true. But I would argue that it no longer suffices as a winning argument for free trade. Amid all this hegemonic competition that exists today between the United States and China, I think the question of who benefits more or who suffers less from tariffs and other interventions becomes a relevant question, relevant questions. Today, interdependence is less likely to be regarded as a buffer against conflagration and more likely a source of anxiety about over-reliance on unfriendly or undependable nations. So this has all been amplified by the pandemic and by supply chain disruptions following the pandemic, by this battle for technological supremacy between the United States and China, these supply chains that start from critical minerals all the way up through finished products. So interdependence is seen more as a vulnerability to remedy and overcome than something that's going to keep conflagration at bay. So today, I think the necessary analysis requires consideration of the strategic benefits and costs in addition to the economic benefits and costs. And that, I think, creates a tension, an existential tension with the rules-based trading system, because the world's largest economies are in a strategic competition where the winning tactics may all too often require measures that violate the trade rules and reduce trade levels. Things like unilateral tariffs and production subsidies, export restrictions, investment restrictions, and so on. Meanwhile, there are other geopolitical pressures that are manifesting themselves now and that are likely to exacerbate this nascent disregard for the trade rules. Things like war, threats of new war, climate change, public health crises and food shortages, debt crises, capital flight, technological rivalry. These are considerations, I think, that are going to induce governments into favoring taking unilateral measures in pursuit of strategic advantages. So I think we should expect to see more governments pursue industrial policies that raise tariffs on certain imports, give subsidies to local firms, grant preferences to trade partners they favor, and penalize those whom they don't. So let's just go back to the GATT system and the support for it, and the rationale behind it. Of course, it was founded in the wake of World War II, and protectionism was seen as one of the contributing factors to the war, and that economic opportunities and interdependence afforded by trade reduced the likelihood of future conflict. And GATT got off the ground in 1947 and more or less succeeded because it had very solid support from the United States. And it had support from the United States because the U.S. Officials saw it as consistent with U.S. foreign policy objectives. The U.S. was willing to accommodate what can be seen as asymmetric GATT terms, different prices of entry, different concessions made. The United States was willing to absorb those asymmetries and accommodate them because they wanted to get as much buy-in as possible for the trading system, because it would strengthen the West against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. At the time, the United States was by far the largest economy in the world. There was no real concern of an economic rival emerging at that time under those circumstances. And of course, you all know the story. Tariffs fell considerably. Trade blossomed in the second half of the 20th century. It's partly due to trade liberalization, partly due to political liberalization, technological breakthroughs like containerization, transportation, communications, revolutions in communications, the internet, et cetera, that enabled trade and investment to really blossom. And then we had 8 successful rounds of trade negotiations under the auspices of the GATT, culminating in the end of the Uruguay round in 1994 with the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. And membership in GATT, which was 23 members in 1947, was 123 members in 1995 when the WTO was founded. So then the Cold War ended, and there was a sense of, this prevailing Cold War triumphalism in the West and in Washington. The West had sort of won and prevailed in the Cold War. The Washington Consensus, which spoke of, advocated for low taxes and less restrictive regulations and free trade, was in vogue around the world. And I think that giddiness, the end of history, what helped pave the way for China's accession process into the WTO, eventually exceeded in 2001. And the United States, there were obviously geopolitical differences about human rights and other things, but those issues were sort of sequestered from the commercial and economic potential, and we sort of focused on the upside of bringing China into this global economy. And in the United States, policy toward China was dictated by was a balancing act. We had the pro-trade business community, multinational community on one side advocating for engagement, and then you had import competing industries and labor unions on the other side, seeking protection, and policy sort of split the difference. And we had disputes. There were trade disputes, and there were mechanisms to deal with them: anti-dumping laws, countervailing duty laws, special safeguards, something called Section 421, which China agreed to allow sitting members of the WTO to impose against China for the first, I forget how many years, 10 years or 15 years of China's membership in the WTO. There was a textile safeguard. We had strategic economic dialogues to sort of act as a lightning rod to absorb some of the tensions in the relationship. And that all seemed to work, reasonably well. And then 2008 hit, and we had the financial crisis and the Great Recession. The U.S. economy was waylaid, and policymakers, opinion leaders were kind of shell-shocked. They were wondering, what happened here? Why are we suffering through this big recession with high unemployment? Our government has a lot of debt. A lot of that debt is held by China. China, their economy continues to grow at double digits. They're doing well. What did they do right, and what did we do wrong? And there was a lot of hand wringing and soul searching, I think, in the United States, and that produced the calls for getting tougher on China. At the same time, emulating also calls to emulate China's industrial policies. So there was this kind of post 2008 convergence of economic protectionists and national security hawks. Started getting concerned about China and its plans for technological preeminence, its indigenous innovation policies and things like that. So President Obama takes office in beginning of 2009, and he sort of responds to this. He brings more cases against the WTO. Under President Bush, his predecessor, we'd only filed a few cases against China. It was only in the last few years of Bush's 8-year terms. But Obama brought a few more cases. There were a lot more anti-dumping, countervailing duty cases. The first Section 421 special safeguard case on tires produced tariffs against China. And then there was a lot of, the ball got rolling on revising export controls and investment review reforms, things like that. So the rise of China changed U.S. perceptions, I think, of the trading system, and that the trading system was conferring certain legitimacy upon China without compelling China to undertake the appropriate behavior, act like a responsible stakeholder. And it was also a concern that it was too restricting of the America's capacity to respond to China's burgeoning state capitalism. So Trump enters the scene in January 2017 after running a very protectionist, anti-China election campaign. And the changes all seem very, very abrupt. There had been this continuity of US policy going back 80 years to the Franklin Roosevelt administration. 13 presidents of both parties generally supported trade, supported the GATT. They, indulged in protectionism every once in a while, but by and large, they saw trade as a positive force. and we're supportive of the system. Trump comes in and thinks protectionism is the tool to make America great again. And, you know, for the first few years of the Trump administration, it was shocking, and it did seem that this was just this aberration, and that we might snap back. But turns out that's not really the case. I think Biden is pretty indistinguishable from Trump in terms of his trade policies. He, hasn't done anything about the tariffs on China, very little about the steel and aluminum tariffs that were imposed under national security guise. He's has no interest in pursuing trade promotion authority, and contributing meaningfully to any dialogue at the WTO. So trade policy has been subordinated in the Biden administration, like the Trump administration, subordinated to national security and geopolitical concerns. And I would say it didn't start with Trump. Trump just changed the tenor. It really started at the end of the Bush administration, where the officials recognized that we were going to have to deal with the rising China, and that we may have to break out of this our restraints with respect to the trade rules. Obama, more quietly than Trump, brought us in that direction. Trump brought us to the over the cliff, and I think Biden is continuing with those policies. And it's not the net economic benefits that we're concerned about anymore. It's the net strategic benefits, and by that I mean both the United States and China can suffer because of a policy, but if China suffers more from the perspective of the United States, that is a win. That's the new calculus. And since Biden hasn't done anything about the tariffs on China, I assume that the Biden administration thinks that in the long term, the relative benefit to the United States will manifest itself. Even though it's bad for U.S. businesses and bad for U.S. consumers, China will be hurt more. And I think that kind of thinking is going to be driving policymaking in the near future. If I can just show you a slide again here, let me get to that. Whoops, I'm sorry. Yeah, let me share the screen again. Sorry about that. Oh, here it is. So this is showing us trade as a share of global GDP in three distinct periods here. I just want to contrast the period 1993 to 2007 to the post-2008 period. I mean, this doesn't look all that dramatic, but I mean, the 3.2% annual growth in trade as a share of GDP is much more significant than 1.2%. I mean, this just reflects the openness and the globalization that was going on during that 15-year super period. And since 2008, we've been plateaued. I mean, 0.0%. I mean, I think it's 0.04 or something like that growth. So globalization is clearly changing, and it's flattened out, and there are a lot of potential reasons for that. One of which is, I mean, we're still trading more, but the global economy is growing. It used to be the case that trade was growing faster than the global economy because there was so many global supply chains. Here it's flattening out. One of the reasons might be because services are a much greater share of domestic economies now, but they haven't kept pace in trade. Services are still not traded all that extensively. So we see the denominator growing, but not the numerator. Likewise, China has reallocated a lot of what used to be produced for export to its domestic market. So the production is still there, but it's not showing up in trade. The other thing is, there's protectionism is beginning to proliferate. So we're now in this flat era, and this flat era is what's inspiring new thoughts about trade policy and trade policy change. Let me go back here. So national security has become a real sacred, has always been a sacred, important role of government. I mean, the first obligation of government is to protect its citizens. Trump expanded the definition of national security to mean economic security, employment opportunities. There's been broad bipartisan support in the United States for ramping up export controls and using them to kind of wage battle to prevent China from making great strides in the battle for technological preeminence. Investment restrictions have become much more rigid than they had been before. And politically, the default is to err on the side of security. Trade versus security. People say, well, security makes a lot more sense. Protect us. And politically, politically, a politician is more likely to be hurt if he or she is seen as weak on national security, when trade is perceived, unfortunately, as an us versus them endeavor. So politicians basically don't get a lot of credit when they support free trade. They tend to get credit when they support protection, because the protection seekers are louder and they're more noticeable. But just if I could take you back, and this is a bit clumsy of me, but let me see. Is that? Let me share this one more time. Sorry. Oh, this was, sorry. This slide was the analog to the other one. This is investment. We saw investment peak during the pro-globalization era, and then dropped dramatically since 2008. So that's just to reinforce the previous one. But let's get to the next one. So this is in the United States, percent of people in the United States who have an unfavorable view of China, and it's going up and down over the years. It's expanded dramatically since Trump, but then again since the pandemic, to 2020, and so with numbers like this, it reinforces for politicians that they should have a sort of strident or cautious approach toward China. So I don't think it's likely that policy is going to change anytime soon. Let me go back to there. Okay. So just a few more points, and then I'll wrap up. So when non-discriminatory trade rules break down, as they are breaking down, with the WTO sort of laying fallow and being disabled at the adjudicative level, no new negotiations really bearing any fruit. There's a greater importance of allies. If you're not going to have non-discriminatory trade and you're going to look for preferential kinds of trade arrangements, then you need to woo allies, and there's a very major importance for soft power. And of course, China has, for the past decade or so, been pursuing this Belt and Road Initiative, providing investment to countries, and developing countries in particular, but some developed countries as well. The U.S. has this Build Back Better, nascent Build Back Better program under Biden, preferential trade agreements. I think Trump was pretty tone deaf with respect to the need for allies. He was very assertive that America first, you owe us. He hit our allies, he hit American allies with steel and aluminum tariffs, and then expected them to be on board with U.S. sanctions against China. Biden is similarly tone deaf, it seems, but I mean, maybe more strategic. His policies are not America first, though; they're worker centric. But it's just the rhetoric that's different. They're essentially the same thing. He's got this Indo-Pacific Economic Forum that he's been touting, which promises virtually, no new market access to the United States, but, sort of requires commitments from signatories to buy into US labor and environmental standards and digital standards and supply chain resilience approach, tax policy, anti-corruption. And so the conclusion I draw from that is the Indo-Pacific is a way of saying, oh, we're not giving you anything new, but if you don't go along, we're going to take things away. You're not going to have this preferential access to the US market. And I have the feeling that this is the direction that we're headed. So before we get there, I would say let's be sure of one thing. We seem overconfident that the American politicians seem overconfident that the world is going to get in bed with the United States on this. And let me just show you one last slide, and then I'll stop here. This is also in the paper, but it's from Pew Research. And this just shows the percentage who say it's more important to have economic ties with the US than China. And Canada, of course, it's on America's northern border, 87% of Canadians. This was done this year. Ironically, or not ironically, oddly at least, Mexico, only 50%. That's also on the US border. But my point is that there are lots of countries that see a major cost to to favoring the United States over China, or to doing something that pleases Washington and upsets Beijing. So these are the kinds of considerations, I think, that are going to animate and amplify trade policy going forward. There is this strategic reglobalization that's going on. I do think that the trading system is imperiled. It's been, they haven't really, there've been no real successful trade negotiations there since its outset. We have countries with disparate approaches and different economic issues to deal with. But I think most importantly, it's that the United States no longer sees it as costless to be a part of that system. I think the United States sees itself as being restrained by that system, and that it's too enabling of rivals, specifically China. So why don't I stop there, and we can have a conversation. I've gone on probably a little too long, but I'll stop, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. I would like to invite our guests, everybody who is watching us, to feel free to drop some questions here in our message here at the box, so I can forward all the questions to Dan. I would like to follow up, taking in account this last graphic that you shared with us, saying this, the graphic that shows who say it's more important to keep relations with the US rather than China, right?
Yes.
And you, as you showed to us, Canada 87%, and we see two Latin America countries, which is Mexico and Brazil. Mexico 50% and Brazil 49%, and we don't see any other Latin America country here. From your perspective, what does it show that Latin America in general believes that it's okay to put China first rather than the US? What is lacking in between those countries and United States from your perspective?
This chart is misleading in the sense that it's just a sub-sample. I think this is G20 countries or G25 or something. So what you see here is you see a diversity of opinion. You see, countries that are closer to China tend to have a lower number here. I think developing countries in general, if we had a bigger sample size, would see numbers closer to Nigeria's, because China is a huge investor in Africa and parts of Asia, and there's recognition that having those economic ties is important. Part of this reflects, I think, also a lack of trust that the United States will be there in the long run. Many of these governments have expressed concern about having to make a choice, and nobody wants to make a choice between the United States and China. Every government wants to be able to have access to the best of both worlds. But I think for some countries, the concern is, the United States has elections every 2 years, every 4 years. The next president might be more isolationist and less interested in soft power and in cultivating relationships. So that the safe bet would say, well, let's stay on the good side of Beijing. I also think that there's also the opportunity for a lot of savvy third countries to get the best of both worlds, to play Washington and Beijing off against each other. But it depends on how this all unfolds going forward. There was discussion about maybe the U.S. and China can limit their rivalry to just the technology sector, and put sort of cordon off that area, and then continue to have a meaningful and engaging trade relationship elsewhere. But it just doesn't seem possible to me if two governments are trying or are in a race, or perceive themselves as being in a race for technological supremacy, and that the tools to use in that race include hamstringing the opponent, making it harder for the other to progress. It's just hard to see how you can have a lot of goodwill coming out in other areas. It's going to be more consistent with policy to undermine, wherever possible. So I do see this sort of Cold War. I know a lot of my former colleagues, a lot of people in the Washington pro-trade community hate to use the term Cold War, but it's pretty evident to me for the past few years that's the direction that we're headed. It's not like there's a nuclear arms race, but a battle to win the hearts and minds of other countries. And it seemed to me that the advantage was to Beijing during the Trump years, because Trump was just so insulting, and he treated our allies with such contempt. But then COVID happened, and it seemed like there was a cover-up, and then Hong Kong and Shenzhen and Taiwan, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has not been denounced by Beijing, has made. I think China has squandered the opportunity to win hearts and minds at that point.
Great. So as you already mentioned, right, the COVID and the invasion of Ukraine, in your paper, you give, as you explain here to us, you gave an important historical background explaining that the rules-based trading system rose from the ashes of 2 world wars and the Great Depression, and now the world leaves those 2 moments, right, the post-pandemic moment and the war in Ukraine. Can those 2 factors, as you just mentioned, COVID and the war in Ukraine, create a new model of world trade system? Or this is already happening and we just didn't realize or put some, I don't know, definition and new rules? And how do you see this?
Yeah, no, I think COVID was a catalyst for, or it was a catalyst in some cases, or an amplifier, an accelerant in other cases, to this whole movement of supply chain resilience and this recognition or this assertion that that we're more vulnerable the more dispersed our supply chains are, the more parties upon whom a country is reliant to get critical, healthcare products or technology products or automobiles or batteries, the more vulnerable they are. And therefore, we should encourage a repatriation of supply chains. We should give incentives to build domestic, semiconductor plants. We should change trade rules to require, a higher percentage of a product's componentry to be manufactured in, say, North America. My view is that the answer to this kind of vulnerability, supply chain vulnerability, is diversification. And diversification doesn't mean repatriation, doesn't mean producing everything at home. Does it mean friendshoring? Well, it seems that's, friendshoring is what the Biden administration seems to be advocating, but I don't really see a whole lot of it happening just yet. Meaning, have your supply chains run through countries that are allied with you. So anyway, I think COVID and just supply chain vulnerabilities because of disruptions from the war in Ukraine, as well as what the war in Ukraine has revealed about the world, that even if there were a plurality of countries, even if there were consensus that, hey, the World Trade Organization is a good thing and we should put our efforts back into multilateralism and make this work, we see from those countries that have endorsed sanctions, those countries that have supported Ukraine versus those who have remained neutral, suggests that there is a very wide range of opinions out there, and we can't assume that we have comity, that we have a commonality of interests. So these are momentous issues. COVID and the war, and it raises levels of insecurity and induces governments into looking for next best alternatives. And war is extremely disruptive. And when you impose sanctions or limit trade with countries, you reduce the scope for trade, which means you reduce the scope for economic growth. I mean, we trade so that we can specialize, and we specialize because we want to produce more, and we want to produce more so we can consume more. And when you get rid of trade barriers, you have a larger market. That all takes off and grows, geometrically. Same thing happens in reverse. You close markets and you say this world is in the China sphere, and this part of the world is in the U.S. sphere. The global economy is going to be smaller. It may be more secure, and I do think one way to capture what we're looking at going forward is governments are not going to be looking for the most economically optimal supply chain, but the most secure supply chain. And so the best supply chain is not necessarily the most economically optimal. It has to be strategically optimal.
It has to be strategic, optimal, okay? And as you mentioned, the sanctions, do you believe we had an interview here also for the Foreign Press Correspondents Association of an interviewee that she argues that the golden days of the sanctions are over. And do you agree with this concept that the effects of the sanctions, then we're talking against Russia, but that impacts the whole world, that those effects that can be felt now, and it won't work in a long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think sanctions in general are an expendable resource, and the United States has turned to sanctions quite a lot over the past couple of decades, particularly over the past few years. And for sanctions to work, they need to be multilateralized. All of the major economies need to be on board, meaning all the major buyers or all the major producers of a particular commodity that is being embargoed or boycotted. Sanctions as a tool of warfare in lieu of sending people out onto the battlefield, I think that's a decent trade-off. I prefer that. But I think if you continue to push for sanctions, some governments just can't continue to stand shoulder to shoulder because their economies are smaller. They can't endure it. It incentivizes countries like Russia or Iran or China to look for other ways around the US dominant financial system, the dollar clearing system, for other forms of currency, other ways to clear markets. It gives rise to black markets. It creates friendships among countries that are, I don't want to say enemies, but countries that we have issues with. And so there are costs, there are downsides. So we shouldn't be so cavalier in our use of sanctions. And we need to recognize that if they're going to work, they can't be unilateral. They have to be multilateral, and they should be used in rare circumstances, not as an everyday tool.
Mm-hmm. Now, a question here on China. You argue that U.S. tariffs on imports from China, originally imposed in 2018, remain in place today despite economic costs to U.S. business and consumers. And this might be because the Biden administration must believe that China will suffer more over the medium to long term through loss of export market share, disinvestment, supply chain relocation, and other adjustments that carry economic, social, and strategic costs. Is this going to work, in your opinion, in favor of the U.S. interest?
Well, I think a lot of things have to happen. What business does not like is uncertainty, and right now there's a lot of uncertainty in the global economy, and because of COVID, because of war, because of changing geopolitical factors, we need to see how things play out. We are seeing companies saying that they're leaving China, that they're moving to Vietnam or to India. We are seeing some disinvestment. There's still quite a lot of trade between China and the rest of the world. But at some point, I think what will have a bigger impact is not the tariffs, but it's the export controls and the investment restrictions that are impeding China's access to semiconductor technology. And this issue is highly debated in Washington and elsewhere. A lot of trade folks will say, when we willy-nilly impose export controls on products, we are depriving, like on chips and chip manufacturing equipment, we are depriving U.S. producers of revenues, which they need. They need those revenues to feed into their R&D expenditures, to create the next generation of semiconductors, et cetera. And by imposing these kinds of sanctions on China, we are hastening their pursuit of self-sufficiency in this area. Now, the problem I have with that argument is that China's been pursuing self-sufficiency for a couple of decades now, and very explicitly over the past several years. So to me, that's not a cost of the U.S. export control actions. That's already happening. But I do think what we need is a way to evaluate the benefits and the costs of export controls. Most people don't know. I'm saying that we need to have the new optimization is not whether the net economic benefits of trade are positive. It's the net strategic benefits, but we don't really have a sound way of measuring those costs and benefits. So, right now the Bureau of Industry and Security at the Commerce Department, which administers our export controls, doesn't have a real sound way of knowing that. They know that, hey, we're depriving China of this technology, and if these sanctions are multilateralized, chances are 80% that it'll be effective, or only 20% that it'll be porous. But we don't know at what cost. We don't know how much the deprivation of revenues to U.S. companies is hurting their investment going forward. So I think my next paper for Hinrich is on something called domestic transparency, which is it's about protectionism and how to shed light on trade policies at home that will motivate people to recognize the costs of protection and speak out against it. Right now, you only have those seeking protection or seeking sanctions that have the ears of policymakers. So part of that domestic transparency would be to include ways to estimate the benefits, the strategic benefits and costs of export controls, investment review restrictions, et cetera. But I don't know. The tariffs seem they have imposed a lot of costs on downstream U.S. companies that rely on imported Chinese industrial inputs and raw materials. They have contributed to a rise in the cost of living. It's inflationary, so it is problematic. But what is the end game? I mean, is the objective to get China to abandon its state capitalist model, to return back toward its pro-market orientation that it had been pursuing up through the early 2000s? It's unclear what the ultimate objective is. It seems to me now we're locked into this technology race that is going to be sort of all-consuming, and we just need to figure out a way to continue to do that while enjoying peaceful and prosperous commercial relations with the rest of the world.
And the population, they have an opinion that leads to the next question, which is about the graphic that you shared with us that shows that 82%, if we're not wrong, of those heard for the poll that they have unfavorable views of China. Starting in 2018, it looks like. The question is, what happened starting in that point that the number of people that are unfavorable to China increased dramatically, in your opinion? What happened in order to have such an amount number of Americans thinking like that?
There's this sort of feedback loop. I would say official Washington started to have its doubts about China on a bipartisan basis, toward the end of the Obama administration. There was this emerging consensus that China had intentions to, continue to borrow Western technology, force technology transfer, subsidize, domestic pursuit of technological patents in a way that produces externalities for the rest of the world. What happened in 2020, of course, was COVID emerged, and part of the narrative in the United States was that that COVID came from a Chinese lab, and that the Chinese government was not being cooperative with the rest of the world in trying to get to the bottom of the origins of COVID, and in fact that they may have had something to hide. And then of course there were Beijing's foreign policy maneuvers, their crackdown in Hong Kong, sort of their bellicose rhetoric toward Taiwan, the human rights issues in Shenzhen, lots of the Chinese government and Xi Jinping in particular was portrayed as sort of a return to Maoist sort of dictatorship. And not that, you know, every American or even most Americans, you know, understand that, you know, the meaning of all that. But you hear it in the news, that the news likes to present issues in an us versus them sort of context. Trade certainly lends itself to that. You know, when we talk about trade, the one thing that the media picks up on every month is the trade deficit. You know, Americans routinely import more than they export, and that is perceived as a sign that we're losing at trade, because exports are our team's points, imports are the other team's points. The trade account is the scoreboard. We have a deficit, so that means we're losing a trade. And the only way we could be losing a trade is if the other team is cheating. And the fact is, trade deficit is not a sign of whether we're winning or losing at trade. When we run a trade deficit, that means we're running a capital account surplus. That's because foreigners demand much more U.S. assets than Americans demand of foreign assets. So the dollars come back in the United States that way. So anyway, my point is, there's a tendency to oversimplify trade as this competition between us and them. And so with growing trade deficit, with all the rhetoric, the trade war, COVID, the foreign policy issues, China's bad reputation metastasized.
So two more questions before we wrap up. One about national security. In your paper, you write that the Trump's Commerce Department, remember that that administration blacklisted certain Chinese technology companies and broadened the scope of technology exports to be restricted, and the Biden administration added to both lists. How those actions regarding to protect national security impact the global trade in between those two countries?
Yeah, that has a pretty significant impact. You know, I'm still deliberating about the meaning of this. I've come to the point where I see value in being very diligent about Chinese investment in U.S. technology, about exporting certain products to Chinese technology companies. But you know, this all began 10, 15 years ago when the United States had the company Huawei in its crosshairs. And started identifying Huawei as a national security threat because of its ownership structure, its ties to the People's Liberation Army. There were all sorts of hearings in Washington, and rarely was anything of importance or substance shared with the public. It was all sort of classified. And for many years, I wrote that I thought that this was an effort to hold back Huawei, which had made great strides forward as a leader in internet communications gear, and that the U.S. wanted to catch up and build a champion to catch up with them, and the United States was going around the world advising other governments to rid their networks of Huawei gear. And I thought this was a commercial objective masquerading as a national security one, but I'm not quite as sure now. Now I'm maybe it's because I'm getting older and I'm a little bit more conservative. That it's better to be safe, but and so I think there are costs. I don't know what they are, costs to these kinds of national security impediments to trade. We need to do our best to figure out what the costs and benefits are, and while recognizing that there are threats we need to have a system in place that has oversight over the BIS, the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security, and others, because otherwise it's very easy for them to say, oh, it's a national security issue, we're imposing restrictions. It's a national security issue, we're banning this investment. So we need to make sure that it's precise, that it's well targeted, and that these kinds of sanctions or export controls are multilateralized, so that we're not just depriving U.S. companies of export opportunities and giving them to the Germans or the Koreans or the Japanese.
Okay, and the last question, which it looks very broadly, I'm not sure if there is a specific answer, but if you can help us with that, a projection, on your opinion, what will become of the World Trade Organization, the future of the WTO, with all that was being said here?
Yeah. Well, look, the WTO is this clearinghouse of resources. I mean, there are a lot of people who are heavily vested in the WTO, a lot of smart economists and lawyers and academics who publish the research there. It is a great place for governments to convene, to discuss trade issues, climate issues that they're moving into now, gender issues, things that are, in my opinion, deviate from the original mandate of the GATT and the WTO. In that system requires consensus on changes, requires consensus on new trade agreements, which I think is going to be elusive. And I don't think that the WTO has the support of the United States or really of China. Push comes to shove, China would not be supportive of some of the reforms that would be necessary that the United States would demand to keep it going forward. But I think the WTO can and should exist as an organization for having conversations and producing research and hearing international perspectives. But I don't think it has a future right now as a venue for new trade agreements, for deciding, adjudicating disputes. Under the original GATT system before the WTO, there was a dispute mechanism, but nobody was required to do anything. You could block the decision. So if the GATT ruled against the United States, we think the United States is violating, Article 1, 2, 3 of this or that agreement, and recommend that the United States comes into conformity, the United States could just blow it off and not worry about it. Under the WTO, there's more compulsion to oblige the findings of disputes. So I think maybe there should just be recommendations or guidances, and that will force governments to hammer it out. The reason we have so much has been laid on the lap of the WTO dispute settlement system is because the trade negotiators over the years they didn't hash enough out. They left too much vague to be interpreted by the dispute settlement system. And the better way to do that is to have that decided at the government to government level. And so I think it's possible, but I don't think the WTO is ever going to return to the form that it had up through the early 2000s.
Oh, thank you very much, Dan Ikenson, for unpacking for us, foreign correspondents, all the critical points of your latest research. So I'm here talking on behalf of all foreign journalists who are here with us today. Thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure, Patricia. I really appreciate the time. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, you can find me at ndpanalytics.com, Dan Ikenson at ndpanalytics.com.
We can put your contact after in our website. This video will be available soon in our in our website. I spoke today in this educational program with Dan Ikenson, Director of Policy Research at NDP Analytics. And this educational program is developed in partnership with Hinrich Foundation. Thank you, all of you who were here with us, sharing with us all of this content. Thank you very much. Have you all a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.